At 68, Peggy stood in a room that smelled of expensive leather and cold indifference, watching 40 years of her life be erased with a single stroke of a pen. The mansion, the millions, the security, it all went to her late husband's children. For Peggy, there was only a brown envelope. Inside sat a rusty iron key and an address for a house in the middle of nowhere. Her stepchildren didn't hide their smirks. They believed they had finally discarded her. They were certain she was left with nothing. To them, her life was over. But they failed to realize that sometimes being stripped of everything is exactly what a woman needs to find herself. That rusty key wasn't an ending. It was the first stone in a foundation they could never touch. The mansion, the accounts, the investments, the children took it all. While they exchanged triumphant glances and mentally spent their inheritance, Peggy held the scraps. A key covered in grit and a handwritten note to a town no one remembered. Even the attorney looked away, unable to hide his pity as he handed over the envelope. Peggy walked out of the home she had tended for decades with nothing but a single suitcase and a wedding photo. She carried the weight of 40 years of love that had been met with a calculated betrayal. But those heirs were young, they were greedy, and greed has a way of making you blind. They kept the money that eventually runs out. They kept the house that will one day crumble. What they didn't see was that Peggy held the key to a secret empire. Richard had built it in total silence, protecting it for 40 years for this exact moment. He was waiting for the day she would need to know she was always his first priority. If you have ever felt the world look past you because of your age, this is for you. If you have been cast aside by those who should have stood by you, listen closely. If you thought your story was finished, know that it is only beginning. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Subscribe now. Because what Peggy found when that rusty key finally turned in the lock will prove that justice always knows exactly where you live. Peggy Ann Morrison was 28 when she married Richard. He was 45, a formidable attorney with 3 children from a marriage that had already failed. It was 1984. Peggy was his secretary then, the kind of woman who kept the world turning without ever asking for a spotlight. Richard was a force, wealthy and respected. When he asked her to dinner after 6 months of work, she was breathless. When he proposed 6 months later, she saw a future of safety and devotion. But the children drew a line in the sand on the wedding day. Stephen was 20, fueled by a sharp anger. Catherine was 18, her eyes already cold and calculating. Michael was 16, caught between resentment and confusion. To them, Peggy was just the secretary who had played her cards right. "You will never be our mother," Catherine had whispered at the reception. Her voice was like honey, but her stare was pure ice. Peggy tried anyway. For 40 years she showed up. She marked every birthday. She celebrated every graduation. She sent gifts that were never acknowledged and love that was never returned. She was the architect of their comfort. She hosted the holidays and prepared the elaborate meals. She kept the childhood bedrooms of children who weren't hers exactly as they had left them. For 40 years, she swallowed every sharp comment about her background. They mocked her community college education. They whispered about her failure to give Richard more children. Through it all, Peggy believed she was building a real life. She managed the great colonial mansion in Brookline. She played the gracious hostess for his clients. She was the shadow that made his light shine brighter. She was faithful. She was devoted. She was always there. Richard was kind in his own way. He provided the right clothes for the right parties. He never raised his voice, but he kept a distance Peggy could never cross. He lived part of his life behind a locked door. His home office was strictly off-limits. He told her he needed a space that was just his. He kept bank accounts she never saw. When she asked about their future, he patted her hand like she was a child. He told her not to worry her pretty head about money. He said her only job was to make the house a home. Peggy followed those orders perfectly. She trusted him with the absolute faith of a woman who has pledged her soul. She didn't even blink when he started taking monthly trips alone. He said he needed to decompress at an old family property. Peggy packed his bags and kissed him goodbye. She didn't know she was building her world on a foundation of sand. It ended on a Tuesday morning in March. Richard was 3 months shy of 85. Peggy found him when she brought his morning coffee. It was a ritual they had kept for 4 decades. 7 a.m. sharp. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack. It was instantaneous. There was no suffering. Peggy stood by the bed with the cup in her hand. The steam was still rising. She felt a strange sense of disconnection. Beneath the shock, there was a flicker of something that felt like relief. She buried that feeling quickly. The funeral was a massive affair. Half of Boston came to pay their respects to the great attorney. The church was filled with judges and prominent families. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael took the front row with their families. They were the grieving heirs. They were the blood. They moved Peggy to the second row. Stephen gave her a tight, cold smile. He told her it was just to make space for her family. But Peggy had no family left. Her parents were long gone. She was an only child. In 40 years of being Richard's wife, she had let every friendship fade into the background. She was alone, in a room full of people who had already decided she no longer mattered. The second row was a silent verdict, a public statement that 40 years of devotion did not make her family. During the service, the air was thick with praise for Richard Morrison. He was the brilliant mind, the devoted father, the pillar of the community. But the man Peggy knew, the husband, was never mentioned. It was as if she had been invisible for 4 decades. At the reception, Catherine stood by the expensive catering. Her eyes were perfectly dry. She whispered to her circle about the pain of losing a father. She said they only had each other now, the real family, as if Peggy had spent 40 years just playing a part. The reckoning came exactly 1 week later. Peggy drove to the downtown Boston office of Marcus Chen. She wore a simple black dress. She styled her white hair exactly the way Richard had always preferred. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. But she told herself there was no reason for fear. 40 years of marriage is a lifetime of service. Surely she would be cared for. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael arrived in a parade of expensive cars. They brought a fleet of lawyers with them. They sat on one side of the long table, a united front of silk and steel. Peggy sat on the other side, alone. Marcus Chen began reading in the flat, grey voice of a man delivering a sentence. The estate was valued at $8.7 million. The house in Brookline, the retirement accounts, the investments. For a heartbeat, Peggy felt the weight lift. She thought she was safe. Then the attorney's voice grew even more clinical. The Brookline residence went to the children in its entirety. The home where Peggy had lived for 40 years was no longer hers. Then the investments followed. $4.2 million, split 3 ways among the siblings. A coldness began to crawl up Peggy's spine. It settled in her chest, stealing her breath. The retirement accounts were next. $1.8 million. All of it went to Stephen, Catherine, and Michael. Peggy's voice was a ghost of itself. Marcus, I don't understand. What about me? What did Richard leave for me? Marcus Chen looked genuinely pained. This was a man who had sat at their dinner table for decades, laughed at Richard's jokes, and praised Peggy's hospitality. Now he held the blade. Quote 1, he began, his voice tight with a visible struggle. Quote 2, he drew a jagged breath and looked down at the document. The words hung in the air like a thick, suffocating smoke. Richard's voice continued through the paper, cold and clinical. He stated that Peggy had benefited from his wealth, his home, and a social standing she never could have reached as a simple secretary. He called her 4 decades of devotion. Quote 5. Quote, he reduced her life's work to, quote 6, quote, and, quote 7, quote. Each syllable was a physical blow. Peggy felt the room begin to tilt. Across the table, Stephen didn't even try to hide his smile. Catherine studied her perfectly manicured nails with a bored, detached air. Michael's thumbs danced across his phone screen, likely already calculating his share of the empire. Marcus continued, his voice heavy.
The will went on to say that while Richard appreciated Peggy's efficient management, his true responsibility lay with his children, his bloodline, the true Morrison legacy. Therefore, Peggy was left with exactly one thing: a property at 47 Oakwood Lane in the small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts. Everything inside was hers, but there was a condition. She had to vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days. The heirs needed it, the rightful heirs. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of Michael's phone. Peggy sat frozen. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories, 40 years of shared dreams and sacrifices, all rewritten in an instant. Richard had discarded her like a contractor whose term had expired. Catherine finally spoke, her voice dripping with a poisonous kind of sympathy. She mentioned that Richard had told them about that Millbrook house years ago, a ruin inherited from a distant uncle in the 1980s. A falling-apart structure in the middle of nowhere. She smiled at Peggy with practiced pity, noting that at least Peggy would have a roof over her head. Stephen was already standing, his mind moving to the logistics of profit. He spoke of staging the Brookline house and the strength of the current market. He wanted her out fast. He didn't see a woman who had just lost her world. He saw an occupant who was in the way. Marcus Chen's voice cut through the greed with a sudden hint of steel. He reminded the heirs that Peggy was legally entitled to 30 full days to arrange her life and relocate. That was non-negotiable. Stephen nodded smoothly, his eyes already on the door. He wasn't being unreasonable, he said. He was just ready to move on. Exactly 30 days remained to dismantle 4 decades of existence. "Take your full 30 days, Peggy," Marcus said. "We understand this is a difficult transition." The attorney slid a heavy brown envelope across the polished surface of the conference table. His fingers betrayed a slight tremor. Inside was the deed to the Millbrook property, officially transferred into her name. Along with it came a rusted iron key and a single sheet of Richard's expensive stationery. The handwriting was unmistakable. 47 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, Massachusetts. "Peggy, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. I am sorry I could not tell you before, but they were always watching. They were always listening. They were always looking for ways to challenge my every move. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love always, Richard. Trust me one last time." The words felt like a hollow echo after his public declaration that she was nothing more than adequately compensated domestic help. He had left her essentially homeless, clutching a deed to an unknown property in a town she had never seen. Peggy stood on legs that felt as though they might buckle. She gathered the envelope and walked toward the door. She did not look at Stephen, Catherine, or Michael. She did not say a word. "Peggy!" Marcus called out behind her. "If you need anything, if you have questions, please call me. I mean that." She offered a single nod without turning back and stepped into the hall. It was only when she reached her 10-year-old Honda Civic in the parking garage that the dam finally broke. She sat in the driver's seat and sobbed until her lungs burned and she had nothing left to give. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael treated the Brookline house like a carcass they were already picking clean. They arrived nearly every day. They brought contractors, interior designers, and real estate agents through the front door. They walked through rooms with measuring tapes and color swatches while Peggy was still standing there. They discussed knocking down walls and ripping out the kitchen she had maintained for years. They talked about modernizing the gardens she had spent decades cultivating with her own hands. They never asked her to leave a room. They simply acted as if she were already gone. She was a ghost haunting a house that had been stripped of her name. One morning, Peggy sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Catherine walked in with a designer, her eyes passing right over Peggy as if she were a piece of old wallpaper. "We will definitely open up this entire space," Catherine said, gesturing toward walls that still held 40 years of Peggy's family photos. "We need to knock this out to create a massive open concept. That is what sells now." Peggy said nothing. She only reached into her pocket
and gripped the heavy, rusted key. A few days later, a real estate agent stood 3 feet from her chair in the living room. Stephen stood beside him. They discussed staging strategies and property values, as if Peggy were a furniture set included in the sale. "The gardens are significantly overgrown," the agent noted, peering out at the flower beds Peggy had tended since she was a young woman. "We will need to bring in professional crews to clean all that up before we can list. First impressions are everything in this market." Those were Peggy's gardens. Every rose she had nurtured with her own 2 hands was now just an obstacle. The perennials. The vision, the decades of soil under her fingernails, meant nothing to the buyers. To them, her life's work was simply a mess to be cleared for a profitable sale. When the sun went down, the true weight of it took hold. Peggy lay in the master bedroom, her eyes wide in the dark. Stephen only let her stay there because the furniture needed to look right for the staging. To him, she was just another piece of decor. Her mind spiraled. She was 68 years old. The world of work was a distant memory from 1984. Back then, she was a secretary with a future. Now, she was a woman with a resume that felt like a ghost story. Who would hire a woman the world had already decided was invisible? The Millbrook property felt like a cruel joke. Catherine had called it worthless, and Peggy feared she was right. If she was lucky, it might sell for $50,000 or $60,000. In her mind, she did the math over and over. That money might last 3 years if she lived on nothing but bread and hope. And then what? She saw her future clearly, 72 years old and destitute. A life spent waiting for a government check in a sterile facility for the elderly poor. Some nights, the terror was a physical weight on her chest. Her heart would hammer against her ribs until she had to pace the floor just to breathe. Then, the fear would turn into a white-hot rage that scorched her throat. How could Richard do this? He let her believe for 40 years that they were partners. She thought she was building a life, but he saw her as nothing more than live-in help. He chose his selfish, entitled children over the woman who had devoted every waking hour to him. But rage requires energy, and Peggy was running on empty. She felt numb as she began the mechanical task of packing up a lie. She filled 3 suitcases with clothes and threw the rest away. Most of it was the persona Richard wanted her to play. She kept only 2 boxes of what was truly hers: old photographs of her parents, letters from her mother, a few books from her grandmother's shelf. 40 years of existence were reduced to the trunk of a car. On day 28, the final blow arrived. Peggy was at the kitchen sink when she heard Stephen and Catherine in the dining room. They didn't even bother to lower their voices. Catherine's tone was cold. She couldn't believe their father had left Peggy anything at all. To her, Millbrook was a waste of $50,000. Stephen's voice was a shrug. He said Richard only did it to ease his conscience. He called her the help. He said she should be grateful they were being so civilized about her removal. Catherine agreed. She noted that most women Peggy's age, with no skills and no family, would already be headed for a homeless shelter. They laughed. The sound was sharp and metallic, the casual cruelty of people who had never known the cold. To Stephen and his siblings, her 40 years of devotion were worth a quote 12 and a few years of survival. Peggy stood at the kitchen sink, her knuckles white against the porcelain. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shatter the silence of that house. Every instinct told her to march into the dining room, to strip away their masks of entitlement. But 4 decades of habit held her back. She had been trained to be invisible. She was the gracious woman who smoothed every wrinkle and avoided every scene. Even now, with her world in ruins, that conditioning remained. On her final morning, Peggy walked through the house at dawn. She expected to feel the weight of 40 years of memories. Instead, she felt nothing. The master bedroom was just 4 walls and a window. The furniture had never truly belonged to her. The guest rooms were cold shrines for stepchildren who only visited out of obligation. She saw the living room where she had played the perfect hostess to people who never truly saw her. The kitchen was a graveyard of 10,000 meals that were eaten and forgotten. Only the garden pulled at her heart. She looked at the roses she had planted in a season of hope. She saw the herbs she had nurtured with love. This was the only space that felt authentically hers. Now, strangers would walk through the beauty her aching hands had built. At 10 o'clock, she loaded her life into the car. 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, 1 wedding photo she had taken from the mantel. Stephen had even argued that the picture was house property. He arrived early, checking his watch like she was a tenant overstaying a lease. He spoke of movers and keys and Marcus Chen's office. He wouldn't meet her gaze. He treated her departure like a business transaction. Then Peggy spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight she had never felt before. She asked him if he knew what it felt like to give 40 years of your life and be told those years meant nothing. Stephen's face turned a deep, shameful red. He stammered that his father had left her a property. "Your father left me a mystery," Peggy corrected him. He and his siblings received millions in the family legacy. She received a rusty key and 30 days to vanish. She told him he had no concept of what he had taken from her. She climbed into the driver's seat before he could respond. She needed to leave before the numbness turned into tears. The brown envelope lay on the passenger seat like a heavy secret. She looked at the GPS. 47 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, Massachusetts.
2 hours and 14 minutes.
That was the distance between the life Peggy had been told to live and the one she was forced to find. As she drove away from the Brooklyn mansion, she wasn't just leaving a neighborhood, she was shedding a skin. She headed west toward Millbrook with a singular, cold promise whispered to the steering wheel. It didn't matter if 47 Oakwood Lane was a palace or a pile of rot, she would survive it. At 68, her family thought she was finished. They thought she was a ghost. But Peggy was beginning to understand a secret they didn't. When you have nothing left to lose, you finally become dangerous. You finally become free. Millbrook was exactly what Catherine had sneered at. Small, rural, forgotten by the clock. 15 buildings huddled around a square like old friends sharing a secret. There was a general store with a tired awning and a diner with checkered curtains. A library built of stone and memory stood near a tiny post office. But as Peggy rolled down Main Street, something shifted. The people didn't look at her with the cold pity she'd grown used to. An old man sweeping the pavement stopped and raised his hand in a quiet wave. A woman tending flowers nodded as if confirming a long-held suspicion. Even the teenagers outside the library looked up from their screens with genuine interest. It wasn't the gaze of strangers. It was the look of a town that had been waiting for her to arrive. The GPS guided her off the pavement and onto the dirt of Oakwood Lane. The world darkened into a deep, vibrant green. Massive oaks with trunks thick from centuries of survival arched over the road. Their branches knit together, forming a cathedral of leaves that filtered the sun into dancing shards of light across her windshield. The road was brutal and rutted with old tracks. Peggy drove slowly, feeling every bump in her low sedan. After a mile that felt like a lifetime, the mechanical voice chirped, "You have arrived." Peggy didn't move. She sat there with her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified that Catherine's venom was true. She was afraid she would find a collapsing ruin. Then she took a breath and looked. Catherine was wrong. The house sat in a wide clearing, guarded by those massive trees like sentinels. It was built from grey fieldstone that looked as if it had grown straight out of the earth. 2 stories tall under a steep slate roof that remained remarkably intact. There was white wooden trim and leaded glass windows. A heavy oak door waited under a carved portico. It wasn't a wreck, it was a fortress. The ivy didn't just crawl, it clung to the stone walls with a deliberate grace, as if it had been trained to frame the windows rather than swallow them. This wasn't the chaotic mess of a house forgotten by time. It was an English estate in miniature, sleeping under a layer of green. The grounds immediately surrounding the house were a tangle, yes, but the skeletal remains of a formal garden peeked through the weeds. You could see the bones of the original vision, stone pathways now half hidden by the grass, and organized beds where roses still bloomed, wild and defiant. A kitchen garden had surrendered to a thicket of herbs and wildflowers, and a fountain stood at the center, silent and bone-dry, yet still holding its chin high. It was a secret kept by the earth, haunting and stubborn, as if time had tried to reclaim it and failed. Peggy sat in the driver's seat, her hands still gripped tight on the wheel, trying to make sense of the beauty before her. Then came the sound. Rhythmic footsteps on the dirt road, coming from the direction of town. A woman was approaching. She moved with a steady, quiet strength that defied her 70-odd years, wearing a simple cotton house dress and carrying a wicker basket shielded by a checkered cloth. She didn't hesitate. She didn't squint to see who was behind the glass. __quote _1 4 ____, the woman said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as if the universe had finally delivered a package long overdue. Peggy stepped out of the car, her legs feeling like they might betray her at any moment. How? How did you know? She managed to whisper. The woman offered a small, knowing smile. We've been waiting for you, dear, she said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Richard was clear about that. He told us you'd find your way here eventually, once he passed. Told us to keep an eye out for a woman named Peggy, driving an older Honda. She held out the basket. I'm Dorothy Harmon. I run the general store in town. There's bread in here, some eggs, milk, coffee and cheese. Figured you'd need supplies. The house has been kept up, but the cupboards are bare. Peggy took the weight of the basket, though her mind felt light, disconnected. Richard told you? He never mentioned this place to me once. Not in 40 years of marriage. Dorothy's eyes softened, carrying the kind of pity that doesn't sting, but understands. Richard came here every month, Peggy, for 40 years. At the very least. He mended the roof, he took care of the land, he spent his time in these rooms. He told us that when he died, his wife would be the one to inherit it all. He said you wouldn't know about it beforehand because he kept it secret for your protection. My protection? Peggy felt like she'd stepped through a looking glass. The world she knew was dissolving. Protection from what? From them, I imagine, Dorothy said gently. The ones who took everything else. His children from that first marriage. Richard knew they'd never accepted you. He knew they'd always resented the life you built with him. If they'd known about this sanctuary, they'd have found a lawyer and a loophole to claim it. So he hid it. He buried the truth from everyone, even you, until his death would make the inheritance final and beyond the reach of any court. Dorothy turned toward the house, gesturing for Peggy to follow. Come on, let's get you settled. The house is unlocked. Richard rarely turned the key. He used to say there was nothing in Millbrook worth stealing, and if a soul needed a roof over their head, they were welcome to his. That was the man he was here. Peggy followed Dorothy up the stone path toward the front door, her mind reeling. Richard had been coming here for 40 years. Once a month, every month. Every weekend trip he had ever taken. The ones he said were for work. The ones he claimed were for visiting his children. The times he simply needed to decompress. All of them had led him here, to a house he never mentioned, to an entire life he kept in the shadows. Dorothy took the rusty iron key from Peggy's envelope. It looked ancient, yet it turned in the lock as smoothly as silk. The heavy oak door swung open without a single creak. Dorothy said in a low voice. She stepped back to let Peggy enter first. Peggy stepped over the threshold. Her entire world shifted. It felt like tectonic plates rearranging themselves deep beneath her feet. The house was not a ruin. It was not falling apart or abandoned. It was stunning. The main floor was open and wide. Plank wood floors glowed with the deep shine of age. They had been cared for with decades of devotion. A massive fireplace of stone dominated the room. Its mantel was carved from one solid piece of oak. The furniture was simple, but clearly high quality. A leather sofa sat there, worn and inviting. Chairs were positioned to catch the changing light. Built-in shelves held hundreds of leather-bound books. Hand-woven rugs lay in soft, muted colors. Forest light filtered through leaded glass windows. It created dancing patterns across the floor. And then Peggy saw the walls. Every inch of space was covered, every shelf, every flat surface. Framed photographs were everywhere. They were all of Peggy. Peggy on their wedding day, glowing and young. Peggy in the garden at the Brookline house. She was kneeling in the soil with dirt on her hands. Her face was bright with genuine joy. Peggy laughing. The camera had captured a moment of pure, unguarded happiness. Peggy reading in a chair, afternoon sun catching the gold in her hair. Peggy sleeping on a porch somewhere in the woods. She saw herself at different ages, in different seasons, throughout 40 years of a life lived together. Each one was carefully photographed. Each one was beautifully framed. It was a private museum, a gallery dedicated only to her. Dorothy whispered from the doorway. Peggy's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Richard passed. She had been too shocked at the funeral. She had been too numb when the will was read. She had been too terrified during those 30 days of being erased. But here, she was surrounded by proof. Richard had treasured her. He had built a sanctuary for the life they shared. She finally broke. Dorothy let her cry for a long time. Then, she gently guided Peggy to the soft leather sofa. Dorothy said softly. She led Peggy through the rooms with great care. She had clearly been maintaining this place for years. The kitchen was a blend of history and comfort. An antique wood stove sat next to modern appliances. Copper pots hung from the ceiling. A deep farmhouse sink stood under open shelves. They held beautiful dishes Peggy had never seen before. The dining room was dominated by a long oak table. It could seat 12, though it clearly hadn't in a long time. Upstairs, the 3 bedrooms were furnished with a simple, quiet comfort. In the master suite, another fireplace waited. Windows looked out over the deep forest. No steny chranili niečto большее. Dozens of photographs of Peggy, some she had never known existed. They were candid shots. Richard had captured her when she wasn't looking. He saw her in the ordinary moments of her life. He saw her when she thought no one was watching. Quote 32 __. Dorothy explained as they returned downstairs. Richard had established a fund. He made an arrangement with the local bank. Utilities, property taxes, basic repairs. It was all covered for the next 50 years. Peggy would never have to worry about these costs again. Quote 33 __. Peggy's voice broke. Why keep this place a secret for 40 years? Why let her believe she was left with nothing? Why let his children take everything while she struggled? Dorothy said gently. She led Peggy to a small door hidden under the staircase. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael. If they had known about this house, they would have found a way to take it. They would have argued over assets and estates. This place was valuable for more than the land. It was valuable for what it represented. Richard protected it the only way he could. He hid it until his death made the gift final. She opened the door to a small windowless study. It was only 10 feet by 12. 3 walls were lined with built-in shelves. They weren't filled with books. Instead, they held folders and binders. Every box was meticulously labeled in Richard's precise hand. On the 4th wall sat a beautiful mahogany desk. A green-shaded banker's lamp stood ready. The leather chair looked well used. In the very center of the desk sat a thick envelope. "My beloved Peggy," was written in the script she knew so well. "This is what he wanted you to find," Dorothy whispered. "This is why he built the sanctuary." Peggy picked it up. Her hands trembled so much she almost dropped it. The paper was heavy and expensive. Richard had used it for only his most important legal work. He had sealed it with actual wax. It felt precious, ceremonial. She broke the seal and pulled out 5 pages. They were covered in his handwriting. "My dearest, most beloved Peggy," it began. The sight of his words brought a new wave of tears. He told her he was sorry. He was profoundly sorry for the secrecy. He wished he could have shared this place with her while he was alive. But Stephen, Catherine, and Michael were always waiting. They were watching for any excuse to challenge him, any chance to claim what they believed was theirs. If they had known, they would have found a way to take it all. 50 years of law practice taught me how to bury the truth so deep no one would ever find it. So, I hid it. For 4 decades I protected this secret, preparing it specifically for you. My feet have touched this floor since June of 1984, just 3 months after we said our vows. I inherited this place from my uncle, Thomas Morrison. He was a quiet historian, a man who lived simply despite the heavy wealth he carried. He left me this house with one final command in his will. Shelter love here, not greed. Keep this place for the person you love more than life itself. For 40 years, Peggy, I have been guarding it for you. I know what my public will said. I know how those words must have sliced through you. Sitting in the cold air of Marcus's office, hearing yourself described as nothing more than adequately compensated domestic help. Please, try to understand my heart. I wrote those words with a sharp, calculated purpose. I knew Stephen, Catherine, and Michael would pick over every syllable, looking for a reason to tear your life apart. I gave them exactly what their greed demanded. I gave them the visible gold and the obvious assets. I gave them the things they could brag about to their friends to prove their worth. I gave them the Brookline mansion, which is actually mortgaged to its limits. It will cost them hundreds of thousands in taxes and maintenance, bound by historical preservation rules I quietly wove into the deed years ago. I gave them investment accounts, locked behind complex trusts that require them to keep steady jobs and pass annual character reviews. I gave them just enough rope to hang themselves while they toasted to their own victory. But for you, Peggy, for you I saved everything that truly matters. This house sits on 247 acres of protected forest. Last year's assessment valued the land at $3.2 million. Conservation groups are already desperate to buy it, but that choice belongs only to you. The house itself is worth another $800,000 as a historical landmark. But this isn't about the price tag. I gave you your freedom. The trust fund I built will pay for every utility bill, every tax, and every repair for the next 50 years. You will never have to worry about money here. You will never have to fear the ground being pulled out from under you. The deed has been in your name alone since 1984. It was established as a gift, entirely separate from our marriage. It is legally untouchable, as my attorneys will prove if anyone dares to challenge you. There is one more thing. The filing cabinets in this study hold 40 years of secrets I gathered during my practice. Information on powerful families and influential names who thought their skeletons were safely buried. I never used this. To do so would have been wrong, but I kept it all documented because information is the only real insurance. If Stephen, Catherine, or Michael ever discover this property and try to claim you manipulated me, you have the means to stop them. The files marked with their names contain the truth of their financial dealings and personal lives, things they would pay any price to keep hidden. Use this only if you must, but know that the power is finally in your hands. Finally, and most importantly, you must understand this. Every photograph in this house was taken with love. Every moment I spent here, I thought of you. I missed you. I wanted to bring you here. But I could not risk your safety until my death made everything secure. You were the best part of my life. Peggy, you were the only pure thing in a life full of performance. I lived for obligations. I lived to maintain appearances. I am sorry I was too cowardly to stand up to my children. I prioritized their judgment over your worth. I made you feel second best. But you were always first in my heart. I failed you by being weak in life. I hope I succeeded by being clever in death. The sanctuary is yours now. You may live here or sell it. You may transform it as you wish. It was built with love. It was protected by love. It is given with more love than I could ever say. You deserved someone braver. You deserved a man strong enough to choose you over conflict. But I gave you what I could. This place, this protection. This is the proof that you were cherished, even when I was too weak to show it. Forever yours, Richard. Peggy read the letter 3 times. Tears carved paths through the dust on her cheeks. Each reading revealed a new layer of his silence. Dorothy Harmon stood quietly in the doorway. She was patient. She was kind. He was a complicated man, Dorothy said softly. He was flawed and weak, but he was absolutely certain about his love for you. Peggy carefully folded the paper. She set it on the desk. Then she turned to the filing cabinets. She opened the top drawer. Everything Richard promised was there. Property deeds showed her sole ownership since 1984. Financial documents detailed a trust fund. Legal papers confirmed her new reality. The second cabinet held something sharper. Folders bore the names of prominent Boston families. These were records of secret deals and hidden arrangements. The third cabinet stole the air from her lungs. A thick folder was labeled for Stephen, Catherine, and Michael. Peggy pulled it out with trembling hands. She sat at Richard's desk to read. What she found was devastating. It was a masterpiece of legal execution. The trusts for his children were not simple inheritances. They were elaborate cages. Richard had designed strict conditions for every dollar. Stephen's $2,800,000 was locked away. He could only access $100,000 a year. To get it, he had to keep a job. He had to pass character evaluations. A retired judge would decide his worthiness. Catherine's trust was even more restrictive. She was required to maintain stable family relationships. Given her 3 divorces and estranged children, satisfying those terms would be nearly impossible. Michael's inheritance arrived not as a gift, but as a sentence. Richard had structured the business trust to require constant, grueling management. If Michael ever stepped away, the entire fund would vanish into a charity. The Brooklyn mansion was no better. Richard had bound the property in a web of historic preservation easements years ago. Any attempt to sell would trigger months of environmental studies and neighborhood reviews. To make matters worse, the house was drowning in debt. 2 years prior, Richard had secured a massive loan against the estate. Now the heirs were solely responsible for the payments. They couldn't sell the house quickly, and they couldn't afford to keep it. Richard had handed his children exactly what they demanded. He gave them wealth, but he wrapped it in misery. For Peggy, he had reserved something different. He gave her safety. He gave her peace. In the quiet of the study, Peggy sat in Richard's leather chair. A sound escaped her throat. It was a laugh. It started small, then grew until her sides ached. After months of being treated as a ghost, the weight finally lifted. She sat in the secret house and laughed until tears came. Dorothy joined her. They both understood the brilliance of it. This was a patient, perfectly legal masterpiece of justice. The first 2 weeks at the sanctuary passed in a blur. Peggy lived in a daze, watching her old life dissolve. The house was a fortress of comfort. It was isolated, quiet, and solid. Everything she needed had been anticipated. The maintenance fund handled the electricity and the heat. Even as the November cold clawed at the windows, the rooms stayed warm. The pantry was filled with supplies that would last for months. Every afternoon, Dorothy Harmon arrived with fresh food from the store. She didn't just bring bread. She brought the town to Peggy's door. Bit by bit, the neighbors began to speak. Each person held a piece of a man Peggy realized she never fully knew. Pastor James visited her first. He spoke of how Richard had replaced the church roof 3 years ago. He had refused any public thanks. He simply wanted the congregation to stay dry. Then came Mrs. Patterson. She told Peggy how Richard had secretly funded her grandson's college education. Because of him, the boy was the first in their family to earn a degree. Sarah, the librarian, shared her own story. When the town budget failed, Richard bought 5,000 new books to keep the doors open. He told her a town without books was a town without a soul. In Millbrook, Richard had lived a life of quiet purpose. He was the man he wanted to be, far from the expectations of Boston. He was generous, he was kind, he was real. One evening, Dorothy sat with Peggy on the stone porch. The tea was warm and the air was still. Dorothy looked at her and said that Richard talked about her constantly. Every time he visited, he asked if the house was ready for his Peggy. He showed her photos. He told stories. He had spent years building a world where she would finally be seen. Richard's words were the only thing keeping her upright. He had told her she was the only person who loved the man, not the provider. Keeping her a secret from his children had been his hardest, most vital mission. 2 weeks into her new life at Millbrook, the silence was broken by a call from Marcus Chen. He told her she needed to be ready. Stephen had already hired a team of attorneys to challenge the will. Peggy asked what their grounds were, surprised by the iron in her own voice. Stephen was arguing that the Millbrook property was a marital asset. He claimed Richard had deliberately hidden its true value. He wanted a court to force a sale and hand half the cash to the siblings. Peggy looked around the study at the filing cabinets. They were packed with decades of proof. She told Marcus to let him try. This property had been deeded to her as a gift in 1984. It was hers long before any marital claims could exist. Richard had built a paper fortress around her. Marcus sighed with relief, admitting he had helped Richard lay those very bricks. But he warned her that Stephen's lawyers were expensive and hungry. Peggy didn't blink. She had survived 40 years of their cruelty. She told him she could handle it. 3 days later, a black Mercedes crawled up the dirt road. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael stepped out into the dust. Peggy watched from the upstairs window as their arrogant faces shifted. They expected a shack, but they found a sanctuary. The stone house stood proud, surrounded by perfectly kept grounds. They looked confused by the obvious wealth of the estate. She let them knock and wait before she walked down the stairs. She opened the door with a calm smile and invited them inside. They followed her like strangers in their father's world. Peggy watched them take in the high-end furniture and the architectural grace of the rooms. Her own face looked back at them from every wall, captured in years of photographs. She let the silence stretch until it became heavy. Then, she gestured toward the living room and told them to sit. She would make tea. She served them using the finest china she had found in the cabinets. It was a legacy from Richard's Uncle Thomas, and she handled it with ease. She was composed and entirely in control. They had come to find a desperate, broken woman. Instead, they found a queen in her castle, radiating a power that made them shrink. Stephen cleared his throat, his voice uncertain. He said they were there to discuss a misunderstanding about the will. Peggy took a slow, delicate sip of her tea. She asked him exactly what kind of misunderstanding he meant. Catherine stepped in, her voice sharpening into a blade. She claimed their father hadn't understood the true worth of the land when he left it to Peggy. They had done their research. The property was worth a fortune, far more than the will suggested. As his primary heirs, they believed they had a legal right to a share of such a massive asset. Peggy just looked at them, her silence more powerful than any argument they could muster. "This property isn't a marital asset," Peggy said. Her voice didn't tremble. It held the steady weight of a woman who had spent decades keeping her head down. In 1984, Richard deeded this land to her as a gift. It was hers before the marriage even began. She had the documents. She had the proof. "We don't believe that's legally binding," Michael said. It was the first time he had spoken. He argued that any gift of such value became joint property. He spoke as if Peggy weren't even in the room. Peggy didn't flinch. "Then I suppose you'll have to take me to court," she said simply. Her eyes moved from one face to the next. "But before you decide, there's something you need to see." She stood. She walked to the study with a back that refused to bend. When she returned, she held a thick folder. It bore their names in Richard's precise handwriting. She placed it on the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. It wasn't just paper. It was a weapon. Quote 45. Quote, she told them. Quote 46. Quote, the siblings sat frozen. Peggy continued. Richard had spent 40 years as a top attorney in Boston. He was a man who noticed everything. He documented every secret, every lapse in judgment. He never used the information. He was too ethical for that. But he kept it organized, and he left every page to Peggy. Stephen's face turned the color of ash. Quote 47. Quote, he whispered. Quote 48. Quote, Peggy replied. Quote 49. Quote, she looked directly at him. There were records in that folder regarding his business dealings, deals that would crumble under the light of day. She turned to Catherine. The financial secrets of her divorces were all there, not a single stone left unturned. Then she looked at Michael. His company had accounting gaps that the tax authorities would find fascinating. Peggy said. Her voice was cold. She stood up. The meeting was over, she said. She leaned forward. Silence filled the room. The only sound was the steady ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael looked at each other. Then they looked at Peggy. They weren't looking at a quiet widow anymore. They weren't looking at the former secretary or the woman who had served their meals. For the first time in 40 years, they saw her. They saw a woman with power. They saw a woman with ammunition and the will to fire. Stephen finally said. His voice was tight, strained. Peggy said graciously, your father cared for you in his own fractured way, I am sure. But he loved me with a depth he never dared to show the world. He simply lacked the courage to admit it, until the silence of the grave gave him a voice. The siblings left without another word. They climbed into the Mercedes and retreated, the expensive car looking garish and fragile on the rough dirt road. Peggy stood on the porch and watched the dust settle behind them. When the woods were silent again, she went inside and sat in Richard's favorite chair by the window. For the first time since his passing, she wept. These were not tears of sorrow or the sharp sting of betrayal. They were tears of profound relief. It was the beginning of a true and lasting peace. 6 months later, Peggy sat on a restored stone porch. She watched the autumn forest transform into a gallery of scarlet and gold around her sanctuary. The seasons had turned, and she had turned with them. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael had abandoned their legal threats within a week of their visit to Millbrook. Marcus Chen handled the final mountain of paperwork, and the estate was officially closed. The Brookline mansion eventually found a buyer, but only after sitting vacant for 5 months. By the time the siblings faced the massive mortgage, the strict historical preservation codes, and the mounting legal fees, they walked away with far less than they had schemed for. The restrictions on their trusts were exactly as exhausting as Richard had intended. His retribution was subtle, perfectly legal, and completely devastating. Peggy spent those 6 months turning the sanctuary into a home rather than a monument to the past. She hired local workers from town to help her reclaim the gardens. The fountain now sang with clear running water. The stone pathways were cleared of moss and leveled by hand. Roses bloomed in disciplined beds, and fresh herbs grew in tidy rows. She modernized the kitchen while protecting its soul. She chose new art for the walls, keeping her own photographs, but adding pieces that moved her. The bookshelves were finally filled with stories she actually wanted to read. Every piece of furniture was selected for her own comfort, not for someone else's social standing. Most importantly, she found her place in Millbrook. She discovered a warmth she had never known in 40 years of Boston society. She spent every Tuesday and Thursday volunteering at the library. On Wednesdays, she was a fixture at the community center. Every Sunday, she sat in the same pew of the small, white church. People greeted her by name. They were genuinely happy to see her. For the first time in her adult life, Peggy had real friends. Dorothy Harmon became the sister she never had. The younger women in town sought her out for counsel. Children waved when they saw her walking down Main Street. She belonged. And that belonging had nothing to do with being a wife or a widow. One afternoon, while organizing the desk in Richard's study, Peggy found one last envelope hidden in the back of a drawer. It was sealed and labelled for her future. The note said, "Open when you are ready." Inside was a deed to another property, 20 acres on the outskirts of town, featuring a small barn and a cottage. It was in her name. Paid in full. There was also documentation for a trust fund of $500,000. It was established specifically for whatever projects or purposes Peggy Morrison chose to pursue in her new life. Richard's handwriting was steady on the small scrap of paper. It held a final, heavy command. "For your future," he wrote, "build something, create, transform." He called this place her blank canvas and told her to paint whatever finally made her happy. For 40 years, she had lived his life. Now, he told her to live her own. Peggy smiled through the tears. She knew exactly what her hands were meant to do. She would build a refuge, a retreat center for women who had vanished into the service of others. It would be a home for widows seeking community, a shelter for those fleeing lives that had grown too cold, a sanctuary for any woman needing time to find her next chapter. She would call it Morrison House. Richard's final gesture would become a bridge for the lost, just as the sanctuary had saved her. The sun dipped below the ancient oaks, staining the autumn sky orange and deep purple. Peggy looked back at the jagged road that led here. She remembered the cold sting of the will reading, the humiliation of being erased by Stephen, Catherine, and Michael. She felt the ghost of that absolute terror, being 68 and starting over with nothing. But then came the discovery, the slow, quiet realization that love can wear strange disguises. Richard was a man of deep flaws. He was weak when he should have been strong. He was silent when he should have defended her. He had prioritized a quiet life over standing up for the woman he loved. Yet, he was also brilliant in his own complicated way. He had spent 40 years constructing a fortress for her, hidden inside a forgotten house. He gave her freedom disguised as abandonment. He handed her power that looked like worthlessness. He trusted her. He knew she was strong enough to find this sanctuary. He knew she was wise enough to see the truth. He hadn't just left her land or money. He gave her the chance to finally discover who she was meant to be. Peggy Ann Morrison was 68 years old. For 4 decades she had been a shadow, the perfect secretary, the accommodating wife, the invisible stepmother, the hostess who never made waves. But here, among the ancient forest and a community that saw her, those roles fell away. She was free. To her own delight, she was realizing that at 68, she was only just beginning. I am deeply grateful you stayed with Peggy through every step of this journey, from the pain of being discarded to the power of being reborn. If you have ever been underestimated because of your age, or erased by those you served, this story is yours. If you've learned that a devastating end is often a new beginning, leave just one word in the comments. Tell us the moment you realized you were stronger than anyone believed. Peggy's life proves a hard truth. Genuine love creates a legacy that greed can never reach. The harshest ink on a legal page can sometimes hide the most profound grace. Justice may take the long road, but it never fails to find the right doorstep. You are never too old, not at 60, not at 70. You are never too far gone to finally step into the light of the life you were always meant to lead. Give this story to someone who feels forgotten. Remind them that their value is not written by the people who discarded them. It is etched in the heart of the one who loved them enough to shield them, even from the other side of the veil. Because together, we prove a truth the world tries to hide. Dreams don't age. Strength doesn't wither with the years. Often the most precious treasures are those kept in the shadows, far from the reach of the greedy. Welcome to our family of survivors. We bloom in our own season, in our own perfect time.